People throw around the word controlling like it is a diagnostic term. They sit in my green room, drinking bottled water, adjusting their microphones, and they look at my producers and say, "My wife is a control freak, she suffocates me." It is a fantastic narrative if you want to be the victim. But in all my years of doing this work, sitting in that chair, looking right into the eyes of thousands of broken families, I have learned one absolute truth about control. Control is almost never about power. Control is about fear. It is a desperate, exhausting attempt to manage an environment that feels entirely unpredictable and profoundly unsafe. When a husband tells me his wife is controlling, my very first question, the one I ask before the cameras ever start rolling, is simple. What did you do to make her so afraid? Because they never tell you what they did. They tell you about the GPS trackers. They tell you about the intense interrogations when they come home 10 minutes late from work. They tell you how they have to hand over their paychecks and beg for an allowance like a child. But they conveniently leave out the chapter where they gambled away the mortgage, or hid a secret credit card for 3 years, or carried on a 6-month emotional affair with a coworker. They want me to fix the reaction without ever having to acknowledge the provocation. Take Sarah and Mark. Mark was the one who wrote into the show. His email was a masterpiece of righteous indignation. He described himself as a prisoner in his own home. He said Sarah demanded passwords to every social media account, every email, every banking application. He said she required a text message with a time-stamped photo if he was going to be stuck in traffic on the interstate. To the untrained eye, reading that brief, Sarah sounds like a warden. She sounds deeply pathological. And Mark sounds like a regular guy who just wants to be able to breathe in his own marriage. When I first reviewed their file in my dressing room, reading through the pre-interview transcripts my staff put together, I could see exactly the story Mark wanted to tell America. He wanted validation. He wanted me to look at his wife on national television and tell her she was crazy. But you cannot change what you do not acknowledge, and you certainly cannot fix a marriage by treating the symptom while stubbornly ignoring the disease. I looked closer at Sarah's responses in her individual interview packet. She did not deny a single thing Mark accused her of doing. She owned it. Yes, she tracked his phone. Yes, she audited his receipts down to the penny. But underneath her admissions, I did not see a power-hungry tyrant. I saw a woman who was drowning. I saw a woman who had been appointed the designated grown-up in a relationship with a boy who refused to take responsibility for his own life. When I walked out onto that stage and took my seat, the energy in the studio was palpable. The audience had watched the roll-in tape. They had seen the dramatic reenactments of Sarah checking Mark's pockets and questioning his whereabouts. The audience was primed to judge her. Mark sat there with his shoulders slumped, playing the role of the beaten-down husband to absolute perfection. Sarah sat rigid, her jaw clenched tight, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. She had built a massive fortress around herself, and the mortar holding those bricks together was pure, unadulterated anxiety. I leaned forward, rested my arms on my knees, and looked right at Mark. I let the silence hang there for a moment. You have to let the room settle. You have to strip away the noise and the defensive posturing before you can get to the truth. I told him I had read his email. I told him I heard his complaints loud and clear. I said, "You feel like you have no autonomy. You feel like you are being treated like a suspected criminal in your own home." He nodded eagerly, leaning into the microphone, ready for me to drop the hammer on his wife. Instead, I turned to Sarah. I did not ask her why she was doing these things. I already knew why. I looked her in the eye and I asked her what she was so terrified of finding. Her tough exterior cracked for just a fraction of a second. It is always in the eyes. The anger is usually just a bodyguard for the pain, and right then, the bodyguard stepped aside. She took a shaky breath, and the real story began to bleed through the cracks of Mark's carefully constructed victim narrative. You have to understand the history to understand the present. You do not just wake up one Tuesday morning and decide to become the warden of your marriage. 5 years ago, Sarah was not checking fake receipts. 5 years ago, she trusted Mark completely. She was the woman who told her friends how lucky she was to have found a man so dedicated to providing for their family. They had a decent life. They were talking about having a second child, moving to a house with a bigger yard. She was relaxed. She was happy. She was blind. The backstory always reveals the blueprint of the crisis. I started walking them through the timeline, forcing Mark to listen to the history he had so desperately tried to erase from the record. It started with the mail. Small things at first. Overdue notices from the water company that he swore he had paid credit card bills that never seemed to arrive in the mailbox. When she asked him about it, he gaslit her. He told her she was disorganized, that she must have thrown them out with the junk mail. He made her doubt her own reality. That is the insidious thing about deception in a marriage. It does not just break your trust in your partner, it breaks your trust in yourself. You start to wonder if you are actually losing your mind. Then came the day the bank called. Not about a late payment, but about foreclosure. Mark had not paid the mortgage in 8 months. He had been intercepting the warning letters, deleting the voicemails, and pretending to go to work every single day while secretly drowning in a catastrophic sports betting addiction that he had hidden with terrifying efficiency. He had completely drained their savings accounts. He had taken out a secondary loan on the house, forged with her signature. He had financially devastated his family while smiling at his wife across the dinner table every single night. I laid these facts out on the stage. Slowly, deliberately, I watched the audience's reaction shift in real time. The whispers stopped. The judgmental stares directed at Sarah vanished, replaced by a collective intake of breath. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly intensely interested in the toe of his shoe. The truth has a funny way of changing the lighting in a room. So I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet studio, "You brought your wife here today, in front of millions of people, to complain that she treats you like you cannot be trusted. Mark, let's get real. Why on earth should she trust you?" This is the turning point in these kinds of toxic dynamics. The moment the controlling spouse is finally seen not as an aggressor, but as a traumatized survivor of betrayal. Sarah was not trying to control Mark because she enjoyed the power. She was micromanaging his life because he had proven catastrophically that he was utterly incapable of managing it himself. She took over the finances, the schedules, the daily accountability, because the alternative was losing her home, her security, and her child's entire future. Her control was her survival mechanism. She did not want to be his mother. She did not want to be his probation officer. It is an exhausting, soul-crushing job to constantly police the person who is supposed to be your partner, your equal, your safe harbor. Every time she checked his phone, her heart was in her throat. Every time she demanded a receipt, she was praying the math would add up, praying that she wouldn't find yet another lie. The control was not a weapon she wielded against him. It was a shield she held up to protect herself from being blindsided a second time. And yet, instead of thanking her for stepping up and saving their family from complete ruin, instead of doing the grueling, humbling work of rebuilding the trust he had shattered into a million pieces, Mark had the sheer audacity to play the victim. He labeled her the problem so he wouldn't have to look in the mirror. When the bottom completely falls out of your life, When everything you thought you knew about your marriage turns out to be a meticulously constructed lie, your brain goes into a state of profound shock. We talk a lot about physical trauma on the show, but psychological trauma, specifically betrayal trauma, actually rewires your nervous system. You are thrust into a permanent state of fight or flight. You sleep with one eye open. You scan your environment for threats because the greatest threat you ever faced was sleeping in the bed right next to you. That is exactly what happened to Sarah. In the weeks and months following the discovery of the foreclosure and the massive gambling debt, she did not just take over the finances. She became a forensic accountant of her own life. She went back through 5 years of bank statements, phone records, and email logs. She was trying to piece together the reality she had been living in, trying to find the exact moment the man she loved had turned into a stranger. And what did Mark do during this period of devastation? He did what almost all caught betrayers do initially. He played the part of the incredibly remorseful, broken man. He cried. He begged for forgiveness. He swore on the lives of their children that he would never touch a sports betting site again, that he would do whatever it took to earn back her trust. He handed over his passwords willingly. He downloaded the tracking app on his phone himself. He told her she was entirely justified in watching his every move. That is the honeymoon phase of getting caught. It is easy to be transparent when the spotlight of your failure is burning intensely bright and you are terrified your wife is going to pack her bags and walk out the door. But true repentance is not a momentary emotional reaction to getting caught. True repentance is a sustained change in behavior over time. It requires humility, patience, and a willingness to be completely accountable even when it is uncomfortable. Mark did not have that kind of stamina. The trouble with fake compliance is that it has a very short shelf life. About 6 months into their new reality, the heavy lifting of rebuilding trust started to bore Mark. The initial shock had worn off, and he decided entirely on his own that enough time had passed. He felt he had done his penance. He had gone to a few Gamblers Anonymous meetings. He had surrendered his paycheck for half a year, and he had apologized. In his mind, his slate was wiped clean, and he expected his wife to just magically reset her emotions to zero. He wanted to go back to being the carefree guy who did not have to answer to anybody. But Sarah was still living in the wreckage he had created. She was still fielding calls from collection agencies. She was still working overtime to claw them out of the financial grave he had dug for them. She was nowhere near ready to let go of the reins. This is where the dynamic in their home began to dangerously escalate. When Mark realized that Sarah was not going to quietly step down from her position as the household auditor, his guilt mutated into deep, toxic resentment. He started pushing back, small things at first. He would change the password on his email and casually forget to tell her. When she asked for the new one, he would sigh loudly, roll his eyes, and mutter under his breath about how exhausting she was. He started coming home 10 or 15 minutes late, deliberately turning off his phone's location services just to see what she would do. He was testing the fences, trying to see where the weak spots were, and every time he did this, every time he exhibited the exact same secretive behaviors he had used when he was actively gambling, Sarah's nervous system would absolutely explode. She would panic. She would ask him rapid-fire questions, her voice pitching up with terror. Where were you? Why was your phone off? Who were you talking to? Instead of recognizing his wife's panic as a direct, rational response to the trauma he had inflicted on her, Mark weaponized it. He started using her fear against her. He would stand in the middle of their kitchen, towering over her, and accuse her of being crazy. He told her she was obsessed, that she needed psychiatric help, that no normal man could live under these dictatorial conditions. He began shifting the blame with the kind of manipulative skill that genuinely makes my blood boil. He started telling his family and her friends that Sarah had completely lost her mind. He painted a picture of himself as the long-suffering husband who had made a single mistake years ago and was now being subjected to endless, cruel punishment by an unforgiving wife. He actually used therapy buzzwords he had picked up somewhere. He told her she was failing to honor his boundaries. He told her she was exhibiting toxic control. He wanted the narrative changed, and he was willing to gaslight his own traumatized wife to do it. The breaking point, the incident that finally drove them to my stage, happened on a random Thursday evening. Mark had told Sarah he had to stay late at the office for a mandatory staff meeting, but Sarah, who had long ago learned to verify every piece of information Mark gave her, called the main office line just before 5 o'clock. The receptionist cheerfully told her that the office was closing early for a plumbing issue and everyone had already gone home. The bottom dropped out of Sarah's stomach. For 3 agonizing hours, Mark's phone went straight to voicemail. The location tracker showed his phone was turned off entirely. Sarah sat on the floor of their living room, physically trembling, unable to breathe, experiencing a full-blown panic attack. Her mind instantly went to the worst-case scenario. He was at a casino. He was opening another secret line of credit. He was destroying them all over again. When Mark finally walked through the front door at 8 o'clock that night, he smelled vaguely of beer. He looked down at his wife, who was hyperventilating on the floor, surrounded by old bank statements she had frantically pulled out of the filing cabinet to check. He did not drop to his knees to comfort her. He did not rush to explain where he had been or apologize for terrifying her. He looked at her with pure disgust. He actually stepped over her legs to get to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator, and looked back at her. He told her she was pathetic. He told her he had just been having a drink with some buddies and his battery died and that he could not live with a psycho anymore. The very next morning, fully believing his own twisted version of reality, he sat down at his computer and drafted the email to my producers, begging me to fix his broken, controlling wife. But I let the silence hang over the stage for a long time after I recounted that Thursday night. I wanted Mark to sit in the extreme discomfort of his own actions. I wanted him to feel the weight of the reality he had created. I leaned back in my chair, steepled my fingers, and let my gaze bore into him. He was trying hard to maintain his posture to look like the misunderstood victim, but the facade was beginning to crack. His face was flushed, and he kept looking nervously toward the audience, acutely aware that the tide of public opinion had violently shifted against him. "Mark," I said, my voice dropping an octave, dead serious and stripped of any pretense. "You wrote to me asking for help because you claim your wife is a control freak who treats you like a child. But based on the unvarnished facts we have just established here, you haven't acted like a grown man in over 5 years. A grown man protects his family. A grown man takes responsibility for his colossal mistakes. A grown man understands that when he detonates a bomb in his own living room, he doesn't get to complain about the dust settling on his clothes while his wife is desperately trying to pull their children out of the rubble." He tried to interrupt. He opened his mouth, raising his hand slightly in protest. "Dr. Phil, I know I messed up back then. I admit that. But I haven't placed a bet in 3 years. I've been clean. She's suffocating me now for things I did in the past. It's not fair." That word fair is a massive trigger in situations like this. It is the language of entitlement. I leaned forward again, sharply, cutting him off before he could build momentum. "Stop right there. Do not talk to me about fair. Was it fair to forge her signature on a secondary loan? Was it fair to intercept the foreclosure notices so she could go to sleep every night believing her family was secure? You are confusing time passing with healing occurring. You think because the calendar page is flipped, your slate is magically clean? It doesn't work that way. Trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. You emptied the bucket, Mark, and then you kicked it down the street. And now you're throwing a tantrum because your wife won't let you hold the hose. I turned my attention to Sarah. She was sitting straighter now, the rigid tension in her jaw softening just slightly. She was finally, perhaps for the first time in years, hearing someone articulate the pure insanity of her situation. She was hearing someone validate that she was not crazy. Sarah, I said gently, completely shifting my tone. Look at me. I want you to hear this very clearly. You are not a controlling monster. You are a terrified wife who has been forced to play defense against your own teammate. But I also need you to understand something crucial right now. What you are doing, this hypervigilance, this obsessive checking, this constant auditing, it isn't working. It isn't keeping you safe. She looked confused, her brow furrowing deeply. But if I don't check, if I don't manage the money, he'll destroy us again. I have to know. I have to protect my kids. Her voice cracked, a raw sound born of sheer exhaustion. I know you think you have to, I replied softly, but firmly. I understand completely why you are doing it. It is an entirely rational response to massive trauma. But here is the hard truth. You cannot control his behavior. If Mark truly wants to gamble, if he truly wants to lie, he will find a way. An addict who wants to hide will always find a darker shadow. You can track his phone, you can demand receipts, you can turn yourself inside out trying to police his every move, but all you are actually doing is destroying your own peace of mind. You are burning yourself out trying to be the external conscience for a man who refuses to develop an internal one. This is the hardest part of the process for the betrayed spouse to accept. They have convinced themselves that their vigilance is the only thing standing between their family and total annihilation. Relinquishing that false sense of control feels like stepping off a cliff in pitch darkness. But I had to make her see that the burden she was carrying was destroying her from the inside out. You have been holding your breath for 5 years, Sarah, I said, watching the tears finally begin to spill over her eyelashes. You are exhausted, your nervous system is fried, you are constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, and Mark, rather than helping you feel secure, is actively shaking the tree, trying to make it fall faster. The issue here isn't whether or not you are controlling. The issue is whether or not this marriage, in its current state, is survivable. I turned back to Mark, my demeanor turning icy cold. The time for hand-holding was over. It was time to force a choice. You sit here and play the victim, Mark. You cry about your boundaries. Let me tell you about boundaries. A boundary is not a wall you build to protect your secrets. A boundary is a line drawn in the sand to protect your well-being. Sarah is the only one here who desperately needs boundaries. She needs a husband who is transparent without being threatened. She needs a partner who volunteers the truth rather than forcing her to become a detective to extract it. He looked down, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. I just want my marriage back, he mumbled, the arrogance completely drained from his voice, replaced by the hollow realization that his entire narrative had been dismantled on national television. No, you don't. I challenged him instantly. You want the benefits of a marriage without the responsibilities of a partnership. You want the comfort of a wife, the stability of a home, and the freedom of a single man with no accountability. You want it both ways, and you are willing to drive the woman you supposedly love to the brink of insanity to get it. I let the harsh truth settle over the studio. So here is where the rubber meets the road. We are done talking about Sarah's controlling behavior. We are entirely focused on your lack of trustworthiness. The only question that matters right now is this: are you willing to stop defending your ego, swallow your pride, and do the grueling, humiliating, necessary work of proving to this woman every single day that you are a safe bet? Or are you going to keep playing games until she finally realizes she is better off managing her life without a giant anchor dragging her down? Mark sat there looking like a deflated balloon. The lights in the studio felt a little hotter, the silence a little heavier. When a man's primary defense mechanism is completely dismantled in front of an audience, you usually see one of two things. You either see a profound, humbling breakthrough, or you see a desperate, angry retreat into deeper denial. Mark did not yell. He did not storm off the stage. He just stared at the floor, the realization slowly washing over him that his highly calculated public relations campaign had completely backfired. He had come here to get his wife diagnosed as the problem, and instead, he was holding the mirror, forced to look at his own fractured reflection. He finally muttered, barely loud enough for his lapel microphone to catch, that he was sorry. He said he would do the work. He said he would stop fighting her. But as anyone who does what I do for a living will tell you, stage tears and public confessions are the easy part. The applause of a studio audience does not fix a broken marriage. The real test is what happens on a random Tuesday night 3 months from now when nobody is watching. After the show wrapped, I asked to speak with Sarah alone in my dressing room. She looked physically drained, like she had just run a marathon with a weighted vest strapped to her chest. I poured her a glass of water, sat across from her, and I told her the one thing she desperately needed to hear, the thing her own mind would not let her believe. I told her she had to drop the rope. In a tug of war, the only way to stop getting dragged through the mud is to open your hands and let go. I explained to her that by obsessively monitoring Mark, by playing the role of his human breathalyzer and his financial warden, she was actually preventing him from hitting the very rock bottom he needed to hit in order to genuinely change. I told her, Sarah, as long as you are managing his disease, he doesn't have to. You are absorbing all the anxiety so he can float through life consequence-free. You have to give him back his dignity, and more importantly, you have to give him back his consequences. If he falls, he falls. But you do not have to throw yourself under him to cushion the blow. That is a terrifying proposition for a trauma survivor. For Sarah, the spreadsheets, the tracking apps, and the interrogations were her life jacket. Taking them off while still swimming in the middle of a stormy ocean felt like a death sentence. But she was so bone-tired, so hollowed out by the sheer effort of keeping two people afloat, that my words finally pierced through her panic. She cried. Not the silent, constrained tears she shed on the stage, but deep, heavy, exhausting sobs. She admitted that she hated the person she had become. She hated sounding like a nagging mother. She hated the constant, acidic churning in her stomach every time his phone beeped. I looked her in the eyes and made her promise me that when she walked out of my studio, she would delete the tracking application. I made her promise that she would hand him his paycheck and tell him clearly and firmly that his choices were now his own, but that her boundary was absolute. If he lied again, if he gambled again, she would not fight him, she would not investigate him, she would simply pack her bags and leave. When they flew back home, the dynamic in their house shifted almost overnight, but not in the way Mark had initially anticipated. For months, he had been begging for freedom. He had been screaming about his boundaries and his privacy. But when Sarah actually stopped checking on him, when she deleted the app and stopped asking where he was, Mark did not experience a sense of euphoric liberation. Instead, he experienced a profound, Terrifying freefall. You see, an addict often relies on the controlling spouse to be their external conscience. Mark had been using Sarah's hypervigilance as a substitute for his own self-control. When he felt the urge to gamble, he could tell himself he couldn't do it because his wife would find out and scream at him. He was staying clean out of fear of her wrath, not out of a genuine desire for recovery. When she removed that safety net, when she stepped back and calmly went about her own life, Mark was suddenly completely alone with his own demons. He realized very quickly that her control was actually a distorted form of deep emotional investment. She fought with him because she still cared enough to fight. When she stopped fighting, he panicked. He started coming home early. He started leaving his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter, face up, practically begging her to look at it. He would bring her receipts from the gas station without her even asking. It is a fascinating psychological phenomenon. When the designated villain steps out of the role, the true source of the dysfunction is forced to step into the light. Mark could no longer blame his stress, his bad moods, or his secretive behavior on his nagging wife. He had to face the uncomfortable reality that he was a man struggling with an addiction and a profound lack of integrity, and that if he did not fix it himself, he was going to lose everything. We followed up with Sarah and Mark about 8 months after their appearance on the show. The update was not a perfect, neatly wrapped Hollywood ending, because real life rarely works that way. Recovery is messy. Rebuilding completely shattered trust is a grueling, non-linear process. Mark actually did have a minor slip about 3 months after the taping. He did not gamble away the mortgage, but he did open a secret credit card and put a small sports bet on it. In the past, this would have triggered a massive, screaming confrontation. Sarah would have investigated, uncovered the lie, and spent weeks policing his every move to ensure it didn't happen again. But this time, Sarah held her ground. She found out about the card, not because she was snooping, but because a piece of mail slipped through. She did not scream, she did not panic. She calmly walked into the living room, handed him the envelope, and told him she was calling a real estate agent in the morning to discuss selling the house. The sheer, cold reality of her boundary hit Mark like a freight train. There was no argument to be had, no gaslighting that could save him. He saw in her eyes that the warden was dead, and in her place was a strong, independent woman who was fully prepared to walk away from a toxic situation. That was the actual turning point for Mark. It wasn't the public shaming on my stage, and it wasn't the tears. It was the absolute certainty that he had finally run out of runway. He immediately checked himself into an intensive outpatient program for gambling addiction. He handed over absolute financial control to a neutral third-party accountant entirely voluntarily. He started doing the actual, unglamorous work of figuring out why he lied in the first place. And Sarah started sleeping through the night again. She told my producers that she still gets a small knot in her stomach when he comes home late, but she no longer lets it dictate her actions. She learned the hardest lesson of all. You can never control someone else's choices. You can only control your proximity to them. People will always throw around the word controlling to deflect from their own bad behavior. It is the easiest, cheapest defense mechanism in the book. But the next time you hear someone complaining about their crazy, obsessive, suffocating partner, I challenge you to look a little deeper. I challenge you to look past the aggressive symptoms and search for the original wound. More often than not, you will not find a malicious dictator. You will find a terrified, exhausted person who is desperately trying to hold a shattered world together with both hands, bleeding from the broken glass, wondering why the person who broke it is complaining about the mess.